Silas Holt had a habit of counting things that didn't yet belong to him. He stood at the crest of the low hill east of the Solberg property on the last Thursday of October 1887 and counted one barn frame sound timber, good roof already shingled, one cabin undersized walls thinned by his standard, one quarter section of flat black soiled land that would be worth considerably more once the railroad pushed the spur line another 12 miles west. He had been watching this particular parcel for 8 months, since before Erik Solberg took sick, since before the fever burned through that quiet Norwegian stock farmer in 3 days and left a 19-year-old woman standing at a fresh grave with more debt than sense. 14 properties. That was the number Holt kept returning to as he studied the Solberg barn through the cold morning air. He had acquired 14 properties in this county over 7 years, each one through a transaction he considered fair. The railroad held the notes the settlers couldn't pay, and Holt served as the instrument by which the land returned to productive hands. He did not think of himself as a man who took things. He thought of himself as a man who resolved situations. The Solberg quarter section would be the 15th resolution. He had already spoken with Jonas Peak, a younger man with capital and ambition, who had ridden out twice to walk the field lines and declared the soil exceptional. Peak would pay a fair price. The railroad would be satisfied. The widow would have train fare back to whatever soft county family she had left in Pennsylvania. Everyone would end up where they belonged. Holt mounted his horse and turned toward the property. The sky behind him was the particular shade of pewter that meant the season had stopped pretending. He had been building in Dakota territory for 19 years. He had learned to read cold the way other men read scripture, with total faith in its authority. The cold that was coming was not the ordinary cold of a hard winter. He had felt it in August, in the way the goldenrod dried 2 weeks early. He had felt it in September, in the way the geese moved south in formation, so dense they briefly darkened a quarter-mile of sky. He had felt it in October in the metallic quality of the air, a sharpness that went beyond temperature and registered somewhere behind the sternum as a warning. Whatever was coming would not be managed by a thin-walled cabin and a stone hearth that threw more heat up its chimney than into any room. He was, in his own estimation, doing the widow a kindness. He told himself this as he dismounted at her fence line, as he looped the reins over the post, as he walked across the dead grass toward her cabin door. Jonas Peak rode alongside him, quieter than usual, his eyes already measuring the barn frame with the calculation of ownership. Holt knocked once a formality and waited. The woman who opened the door was smaller than he remembered from the one occasion he had met her at the county recorder's office when Erik Solberg filed the Homestead extension. She had stood beside her husband then, with her hands folded and her dark eyes moving between the documents and the men handling them, saying nothing, missing nothing. Now she stood alone in the doorway of a cabin that exhaled cold air into the already cold morning, and she looked at Holt with an expression he had encountered before, the expression of a person who has been expecting a specific kind of trouble and has decided in advance not to show that they are afraid of it. She was 19 years old. She did not look 19. She looked like someone grief had aged from the inside out, pushing through the surface in the set of her jaw and the stillness of her hands. Holt stated his purpose without ceremony, because ceremony was a form of dishonesty he had discarded long ago. He represented the Northern Pacific's Land Management Office. He had reviewed the Solberg account. The note Erik had extended in March, the additional draw for spring seed, placed the total obligation beyond what the property could service, particularly given that the planting season had been interrupted. He wanted to be clear that he was not without sympathy. He wanted to be clear that what he was offering was, under the circumstances, generous. He watched her face as he spoke. She did not flinch. Behind him, Peak had dismounted and stood at a distance that was technically respectful, but positioned to give him a clear view of the barn's structural joints. The cabin behind her was a single room. He could see the wood pile through the window, a stack so inadequate it was almost an insult to the winter that was coming. He could see the small stone hearth, the thin chinked walls already contracting in the dry cold, the hairline gaps where the Montana wind would find its way in. He had built homes in this territory for nearly 2 decades, And he could read the death of a shelter the way a doctor reads the failure of a body, in the small signs, the coloring, the sounds, the measurements that don't quite add up to survival. A train ticket, a forgive a debt, a clean signature. All she had to do was understand that the outcome was already determined. This is my home. Her voice was low, the words chosen with a precision that suggested she had been holding them in reserve. Erik built this place for us. Holt did not look away from her face. Erik is gone. He said it without cruelty because cruelty was not the point. What he built was a beginning, not a finished thing. A beginning without the man who was meant to continue it is just lumber and debt. Something moved in her eyes, not fear. He would have known what to do with fear. It was something closer to a decision being made in real time, a recalculation so interior, he almost missed it. I have until the 1st of December, she said. You do? Then I have nothing to discuss with you until then. He held her gaze for a moment. In the background, Pete had walked around the side of the barn, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. The sound was more eloquent than anything Pete might have said directly. It was the sound of a man already planning renovations. Holt gave a short, deliberate nod. He told her he would return on the 1st. He told her to be practical. He said the word practical not as a suggestion, but as a verdict, and then he walked back to his horse mounted and rode out without looking back. He did not need to look back. He had made this ride 14 times. There is a particular cruelty in a Dakota October that announces itself as mildness. The same week Holt paid his visit, the temperature climbed back above 40 degrees for 4 days. The sky turned a pale, accommodating blue, and the brown grass on the Solberg quarter section caught enough light to look almost gold. It was the kind of weather that encouraged a person to believe the worst had been delayed. Maren Solberg did not believe it. She had lived beside Erik Solberg for 14 months on this land, and he had taught her to read the prairie the way the prairie wanted to be, read honestly without the comfort of wishful interpretation. The mild spell was not mercy, it was the deep breath before a sentence. She spent those 4 days doing what she had been doing since Erik's coffin went into the ground in September, the mechanical work of continuing. She fed the 2 chickens that remained. She hauled water from the well before it froze solid each morning and stored it in the cabin in every vessel she owned. She ate sparingly from the provisions in the corner, a sack of oats, a crock of salt pork, dried beans, and 8 jars of preserved tomatoes she had put up in August when the garden still existed and the future still seemed like a place she would actually arrive at. She did not open the letter from her mother in Pennsylvania. She had been not opening it for 3 weeks. She knew what it said without reading it. Come home. There is nothing left to prove. You are a young woman alone in a place that was never kind to people alone. Her mother was not wrong. The math was not wrong. The cabin walls were not wrong in their slow contraction, their audible settling in the night cold, their clear communication that they had not been built to last. Erik had planned to thicken the walls the following summer to add a proper sleeping loft to replace the stone hearth with something iron and serious. He had plans for everything. He had bought 2 window sashes, beautiful things double-paned with brass hardware that still sat wrapped in cloth in the corner of the barn, waiting for the house that was going to be built around them, the house that no longer had a builder. She thought about Erik at all hours, which meant she thought about him constantly, which meant there was a version of thinking that was less like thought and more like weather ambient, inescapable coloring, every perception without announcing itself. She thought about his hands, which had been calloused in specific places from specific tools so that when he held her hand, his fingers felt like a map of all his labor. She thought about the evening in March when he had come back from Holt's office with the extension papers, and the look on his face that was relief badly disguised as confidence. The extra draw for seed the bet on a good planting season, the private calculation that everything would be fine if the rains came right. The rains had come right, the fever had not. 3 days. That was the entire duration of the illness that took him. She had sat beside him through all three, watching the temperature in his face climb past anything she could measure. Listening to the breathing that changed on the second day, holding his hand, while the calluses that mapped his labor pressed against her palm, and the maps began to mean less and less. The doctor had come from 30 miles away too late and had said things she could not hear over the sound of what had already happened. The week after Erik's burial, she had sat at the small table in the cabin and stared at the deed to the property. Her name was on it alongside his. She had not known when she first came west with him that a woman's name could be on a deed. She had not known what to do with the information then. She did not know what to do with it now. But it was there printed in the formal ink of the county recorder's office, and it was the only thing she owned outright in a situation where everything else was owed. Silas Holt wanted that name removed. The evening after his visit, she had done something she was not yet willing to examine directly. She had gone to the small desk in the corner and taken out the deed transfer document that Holt had left on her previous meeting unsigned, sitting in her drawer since September. Like a live thing, she was pretending not to notice, and she had picked up the pen. She had held the pen for a long time. The cabin was cold enough that she could see her breath. The woodpile outside was visible through the window, and even in the failing light, she could count the logs, and the count was not good. The account at Hendrick's General Store in town was 60 days past due. Jonas Peak had ridden around her barn that morning with the proprietary ease of a man already measuring for new fence posts. She set the pen down without signing. She was not sure why. It did not feel like courage. It felt like the absence of a next step, a paralysis that sometimes masquerades as resolve. She went to the large trunk at the foot of the bed. She was looking for Erik's second wool shirt, which she had been sleeping in since September. She found it near the top, folded with the careful impracticality of a woman who had been trying to keep something preserved. Beneath it were her own things, the dress she had been married in, a small book of poetry her sister had given her, a folded map of the territory that she and Erik had studied together on the train west. She moved these aside. At the very bottom, flat against the cedar-scented wood, was a book she had not thought about in over a year. Her grandmother's journal. Grandma Ingrid had died when Maren was 15 in the farmhouse outside of Minneapolis, where she had lived since coming to Minnesota as a girl with her parents, part of the wave of Scandinavian families that had moved into the upper Midwest in the 1860s and 1870s. She had been a compact, silver-haired woman who smelled of dried herbs and moved through the world with the efficiency of someone who had learned not to waste motion. She had a habit of writing things down, not in the way that people write to remember, but in the way they write to teach, as though the page were a student who needed careful instruction. Recipes, observations about weather, structural diagrams that looked like something between architecture and folk art. Maren's mother had pressed the journal into her hands at the funeral and said simply, "She would have wanted you to have this." Maren had packed it when she came west. It had seemed important in the abstract way of inheritance. She had not opened it since. She opened it now. The pages smelled of dried lavender and something she couldn't name, some dry botanical quality that belonged to her grandmother's kitchen. The handwriting was the precise, slightly slanted script of a woman who had been formally educated in a place and time that didn't always educate women formally, each letter deliberate, each word placed. Maren turned past the first section, preserving instructions, notes on root vegetables, a diagram of a kitchen garden, and into the middle of the book, where the handwriting changed slightly, became less formal and more urgent, as though Grandma Ingrid had been writing faster or thinking harder. She found what she found not because she was looking for it, but because the book fell open to a page that had been consulted many times. The spine cracked and softened at that particular point. The page was headed in careful block letters, Earth Heat House. Below it were cross-sectional diagrams. Maren stared at them for a long time. They were precise drawings of structures dug into the ground. Not root cellars, not simple pits, but engineered spaces with specific measurements, with annotations about angles and materials, and what looked like calculations of depth relative to frost penetration. One diagram showed a long sloped surface on the south-facing side marked with what she gradually understood to be glazed panels, windows laid nearly flat to the ground. Another showed a cross-section of a floor made of stacked stone with a notation she worked out as meaning slow release 2 days minimum. The text around the drawings was dense with technical observation. Grandma Ingrid had not been recording something she had heard about. She had been recording something she had tested. Maren sat at that table for 3 hours working through the journal entry. Some of the notation was in a technical shorthand that took her time to parse. Some of it referenced materials by name she had to reason through from context. The core principle, once she had wrestled it clear from the surrounding detail, was almost offensive in its simplicity. The ground below the frost line maintained a constant temperature year-round. It did not fluctuate with the weather above. It stored the accumulated warmth of summer and released it slowly through winter. A space built deep enough into the earth would inherit this stability. A floor of high-density stone properly charged with periodic, intense heat would extend and amplify it. The earth was not a surface to build upon. It was a resource to build within. Grandma Ingrid had written in the plain declarative style she used when she was most certain of something. The men who build high walls and burn great fires are fighting the wrong battle. The cold is not a thing to defeat. It is a condition to negotiate with, and the earth has already negotiated the best terms available. We only have to accept them. Maren closed the journal. She sat in the cold cabin and looked at the window where the pale ghost of her breath hung in the air and dissipated. She thought about the barn. Erik had built the frame and the roof before the fever. The structure was sound, better than sound actually, because Erik had overbuilt in the way of a man who expected to fill the barn eventually and wanted the bones to be adequate for animals and equipment that didn't yet exist. The roof was shingled with good cedar, properly pitched. The walls were solid timber, but the floor was still packed earth. He had planned to lay planking before winter had the boards ordered hadn't gotten to it. A barn with a packed earth floor. A barn standing directly over soil that hadn't frozen yet, protected from the surface cold by its own roof, a starting point. She also thought about something Erik had mentioned once in passing in that way he had of narrating the land's history as he learned it, that there had been an earlier homesteader on this parcel, a man named Lars Hagen, who had left in 1879 and whose improvements had mostly been reclaimed by weather. Erik had found evidence of a root cellar somewhere under the barn floor. He had mentioned digging it out someday when there was time. There had not been time. Maren stood up. She put on her coat, her scarf, her heaviest gloves. She took the lantern from the hook by the door, lit it, and walked across the yard to the barn. The cold inside the barn was different from the cold outside still. Rather than moving heavy, rather than sharp. The lantern threw a yellow circle of light that reached the near walls and suggested the far ones. She stood in the center of the packed earth floor and held very still, looking down, which she understood was not a rational way to see things, but which felt right anyway. She walked the length of the floor slowly, the lantern held low. Near the center of the barn, the ground had a slightly different quality underfoot. Not softer exactly, but less resistant, the way soil feels when it has been disturbed and resettled. Rather than compressed steadily over years, she crouched and pressed her palm flat to it. Barely perceptible, but real, the surface gave fractionally more than the ground, 6 inches to either side. She drove the tip of her shovel in. It bit with a crunch that was satisfying in a way she hadn't expected, the sound of engagement, of action, meeting resistance and winning. She pulled it out and drove it in again, slightly to the left. Again. She began to work outward from the center point, feeling for the boundaries of whatever was beneath her. In the corner of the barn, tucked against the east wall under a section of canvas that she had assumed covered spare fence posts, she found something she had not been looking for. A wooden crate weathered to the gray of old driftwood, and inside it a collection of items left by the barn's first builder. A coil of rope too old to trust, a broken hinge, 2 horseshoe nails rusted to coral, A small notebook, its cover warped with old moisture, its pages brittle at the edges. She almost set it aside. She opened it instead. The handwriting was different from Grandma Ingrid's, larger, less schooled, with the cramped look of a man writing by inadequate light. The name on the first page was Lars Hagen, and the year beneath it was 1876. The notebook was a construction, log measurements, materials, dates, complaints about the weather, written in the same tone as the measurements, as though weather were simply another variable to be recorded rather than endured. She flipped through it, reading fragments. Then she found the entry dated September 14th, 1877, and slowed down. Hagen had built the cellar himself. He described it in the methodical way of someone recording the construction for his own future reference. Stone walls 12 inches thick. Arched brick ceiling, which he had learned from his father's root cellar in the upper Midwest. Depth 10 feet, dimensions 10 by 12. He had connected the cellar to a chimney flue with a small opening that allowed some air exchange. He had used the cellar for 3 winters before leaving the property. The notebook's last entry was dated February 1879, leaving in spring, too far from town. Cellar works fine. Never froze. Never froze. Marin sat back on her heels in the lantern light and looked at the patch of disturbed earth in front of her. She looked at the notebook in her hand. She looked at the diagrams she had been studying in Grandma Ingrid's journal for 3 hours, diagrams made by a woman who had arrived at the same principles through entirely different experience and committed them to the same kind of careful record. 2 people from different starting points arriving at the same answer. She set down the notebook, picked up the shovel, and went back to work. The test hole she had been digging was about 18 inches deep when the shovel hit something solid and flat. Not a rock. The sound was wrong for rock, a dull wooden thud, rather than the ring of metal on stone. She cleared the dirt away with her hands, the cold ground numbing her fingers through her gloves within minutes. The shape that emerged under her palms was a plank, thick and old, its grain compressed by years of soil pressure into something that felt almost like stone itself. She worked sideways from it and found the edge, then another plank running parallel. A door, a heavy cellar door, lying flat in the earth, covered by 10 years of accumulated soil and debris. Its iron ring so rusted it had blended into the surrounding ground until her fingers found it by feel rather than sight. She tried to lift it by the ring and felt the resistance of something that had not moved in a decade. She needed leverage. She found a timber beam propped against the barn wall, a long piece of construction lumber, left from the framing, and wedged one end under the iron ring, using the barn's floor joist as her fulcrum. She leaned her weight onto the other end. The beam flexed. The ground around the door's edges cracked and breathed out a thin ghost of stale air. She pushed harder. There was a sound like a large seam being torn, a deep structural protest that seemed to come from beneath her feet, and then the door lifted in a single shuddering movement that surprised her into stepping back. She caught it before it fell closed again. She held it open with the beam wedged at an angle, and then she stood and looked down. A bird came out. It came from somewhere below the top step. A small brown sparrow that materialized from the darkness passed within a foot of her face in a burst of wings that made her stumble back, and was gone through the open barn door before she had time to form a reaction. She stared after it, stood in the sudden silence. Then she looked back down at the opening. Stone steps descended into dark. They were damp-looking but not crumbling. The air that rose from them was not the wet, rotten air of a failed cellar. It was cool and still, with a quality that was almost mineral, the deep, settled air of a space that had been sealed for years, but had not flooded, had not collapsed, had simply been waiting. She lit the second candle she'd brought from the cabin, cupped her hand around its flame, and went down. Each step took her further from the wind. By the time she reached the bottom 10 steps she counted, the barn above her was only a memory of cold. The temperature here was constant in a way that the surface world never managed, the cool of deep earth that sits below the reach of frost, below the reach of the season's variation in the steady thermal layer, where the ground remembers summer, the same way old stone remembers the hands that shaped it. She held the candle up. The cellar was exactly what Lars Hagen's notebook had promised: 10 by 12 stone walls, a foot thick, a low arched ceiling of old brick. It was empty except for a coating of fine dust on every surface and two rotted wooden shelves collapsed against the far wall. In the back left corner, partially obscured by the remnant of what had once been a storage crate, she found the flue Hagen had described: a narrow opening in the stone choked with debris, but structurally intact, leading upward through the wall. She turned slowly in the small space, moving the candle to see each wall, each corner, each section of floor. Then she saw the problem. The far right corner of the stone wall, the northeast corner, the one most exposed to groundwater from the slope of the terrain, had a section roughly 2 feet wide where the mortar had failed completely. The stones had not fallen, held in place by the arch above them and the soil pressure behind them, but the gap between them was finger width in places, and the soil behind the stone was saturated. A thin seep of water had worked its way through and pooled in the corner, freezing at the surface and muddy below, a slow, patient infiltration that had been working through the wall for years. The cellar was not usable in this condition. The moisture would undermine any insulating quality the space possessed. The stone floor Grandma Ingrid's journal prescribed would not work over wet ground. The thermal charge would dissipate into the water rather than radiating upward into the room. Before anything else, that wall had to be repaired. Maren stood in the corner of the cellar and looked at the gap in the stone and felt the specific weight of a problem that required knowledge she did not have. She knew how to run a household, how to put up preserves, how to keep accounts, how to read a deed. She did not know how to repair a mortared stone wall. She climbed back up the steps. She crossed the barn, stepped out into the yard, and stood in the open air for a moment. The sky had gone the deep, bruised purple of early evening, and the temperature was dropping with the sun. The mild spell was over. She could feel it in the way the air bit at the exposed skin on her face, a new quality, a seriousness that the week's warmth had been masking. She looked at the wood pile. She counted the logs. She thought about the 5 weeks until December 1st, about Holt's deliberate walk around her barn, about Peak's eyes measuring the field lines. Then she thought about Agnes Drury. Agnes lived 2 miles north on a quarter section she had worked alone since her husband Thomas died in 1878. She was 60 years old, built compactly and efficiently, and she spoke in the direct, ungarnished way of a woman who had stopped having patience for social performance around the time she stopped needing anyone's approval. Maren had met her twice, once at the Harvest Social in September, and once in line at Hendrick's store, where Agnes had looked at Maren's supply list, looked at Maren and said without particular gentleness, "You're going to need 3 times that amount of salt pork if you mean to get through February. First winter's always the one that teaches you." It had felt at the time like criticism. Now it felt like evidence of competence. There was something else Maren remembered. At the Harvest Social, when Holt had walked in, Agnes had turned her back to him in a movement so deliberate it registered across a crowded room. Someone standing near Maren had murmured, "He took the Drury pasture land in '78. Said Thomas had defaulted. Agnes always said the accounting was wrong." The murmur had been quiet, the way things that are widely known are sometimes kept quiet out of the particular courtesy that replaces justice in small communities. Agnes Drury knew Silas Holt. Agnes Drury knew how to work with stone. Maren had seen her once stacking a fence line with the practiced hand of someone who had done it many times, each stone placed with the calm authority of a person who understood how things fit together. Maren went back inside the cabin. She did not open the unsigned deed transfer document. She went to bed in Erik's wool shirt with her coat on top of the blankets, and Grandma Ingrid's journal open on the pillow beside her, the cross-sectional diagrams facing up, catching the thin moonlight that came through the cabin's single window. She slept 4 hours. When she woke, it was before dawn, and the inside of the window had a fine lacework of frost across its lower edge. She got up, started the fire with the last of the small wood, and began making a list. Not of reasons to stay or reasons to leave. A list of materials, a list of measurements, a list of things to ask Agnes Drury in the order most likely to produce answers from a woman who did not waste words. The fire burned low. She added the last split log and went back to the list. Outside, the wind had picked up from the north, carrying the particular quality she was beginning to recognize. The metallic scent, the authority, the absence of any promise that things would moderate. She wrote wall repair mortar, Agnes. She wrote stone floor granite if possible, sandstone, if not check, Hagen's notebook for quarry location. She wrote rendering pod already in barn, too heavy to move, build platform instead. She wrote glazed panels, Erik's window sashes, southeast wall, angle of winter sun. She underlined the last item. Then she set the pen down, looked at the dying fire, looked at the window with its frost lace edge, looked at the deed on the desk that she still had not signed, looked at the journal open beside her, with Grandma Ingrid's careful diagrams filling the page. The cold was a fact. The debt was a fact. Holt would come back on December 1st with his leather satchel and his granite certainty and the name of the man who would take possession of this land the moment her name came off the deed. These were all facts. Also a fact 10 feet below the barn floor, a stone-walled room had spent 10 years waiting in the dark, holding the temperature of a depth that frost could not reach. Never freezing, never fluctuating, simply persisting at the steady, generous temperature of ground that remembers what summer felt like. A bird had been living in it. A sparrow, small and brown and not built for Dakota winters, had spent some portion of the season in that sealed space and emerged whole. Maren folded the list and put it inside Grandma Ingrid's journal. She banked the fire's last coals. She went to the window and looked out at the dark yard, the darker barn, the pale geometry of the sky beginning its slow turn toward dawn in the east. Erik. Not a question, not quite a prayer. Just his name said aloud in the cold room, the consonants sharp in the chill air. I'm going to try something. The only answer was the wind, which had the decency for once to sound less like a threat than like a condition present, measurable something a person with the right knowledge could account for. She put on her coat, picked up the lantern, and walked back out to the barn. Agnes Drury opened her door on the first morning of November, looked at the young woman standing on her step with a leather journal under one arm and frost on her eyelashes, and did not invite her in. You're the Solberg widow. I need someone who knows how to repair a stone wall underground. I was told you built the fence line on your south pasture yourself. Agnes studied her for a long count of seconds. The wind moved between them, carrying the particular dry cold of a plains morning that has given up on autumn. Agnes was 60 years old, built close to the ground, with hands that looked like they had been carved from the same fieldstone she used for fencing, square cracked at the knuckles, perpetually dusty with something mineral. Her face had the quality of leather that has been left in weather until it stops being leather and becomes landscape. I built that fence line because no one else was going to build it. That's not the same as being a mason. It's closer than anything I have. Agnes looked past Maren at the empty road, the flat horizon, the sky that promised nothing generous. Then she looked back at the journal under Maren's arm, at the list protruding from its pages, at the specific quality of desperation in Maren's posture, a desperation that was not begging, but organizing, not flailing, but calculating. You better come inside. I'll make coffee. You can explain what kind of fool thing you're planning, and I'll tell you why it won't work, and then we'll see. The explanation took 2 hours. Maren laid the journal open on Agnes's kitchen table, weighted the pages with a salt cellar and a tin cup, and walked her through Grandma Ingrid's diagrams with the methodical patience of someone who had rehearsed this presentation in her head during the 2-mile walk north. She described the cellar, its dimensions, its construction, its condition. She described the damaged wall, the seepage, the pooling water. She described with a precision that surprised Agnes visibly the thermal principles at work, the constant temperature below the frost line, the capacity of dense stone to absorb and slowly release heat, the physics of a space that did not fight the cold, but simply declined to participate in it. Agnes listened without interrupting. When Maren finished, Agnes picked up the journal, held it at arm's length because her eyes were not what they had been, and studied the cross-sectional diagram of the stone floor for a full minute. Your grandmother drew this. She did. she ever build one. The journal says she helped her family build something similar when she was young, in Minnesota during the hard winters in the 60s. Agnes set the journal down. She looked at Marin with an expression that was not yet respect, but was adjacent to it, the look of a woman recognizing competence in an unexpected place. The wall repair I can do. I've mortared worse than what you're describing, though not underground, not in November. The mortar has to cure before it freezes, or it's worthless. We'll need to keep a small fire near it for days. That alone is a problem. She paused. Why are you doing this instead of signing Holt's paper? Marin did not answer immediately. She looked at her own hands on the table at the blisters that had already started forming from 2 nights of digging. She thought about the question honestly because Agnes was the kind of person who would know if she didn't. Because my name is on the deed, mine, not just Erik's. Holt wants to take something that has my name on it, and every reason he gives for why I should let him is a reason that assumes I can't do anything about the cold except what men have always done about it: burn more wood, build thicker walls. My grandmother knew a different way. I don't know if it will work here, but I know that signing that paper means it definitely won't. Agnes was quiet for a moment. Then she pushed back from the table and stood. Her chair scraped against the floor with a sound like a declaration. I'll help you with the wall. I'm not doing it because I think you're right. I'm doing it because Silas Holt took 40 acres of bottomland from my husband's estate using arithmetic that didn't survive scrutiny, and I have been waiting 8 years for a chance to watch that man be wrong about something. She took her coat from the hook by the door. It was a man's coat too large for her, the wool worn thin at the elbows. She put it on with the practiced efficiency of a woman who dressed for work, not appearance. Let's go look at your hole. They reached the Solberg property by mid-morning. Agnes descended the cellar steps with the lantern held low, her free hand touching the wall as she went, reading the stonework with her fingertips, the way Marin had seen blind people read faces. She spent 20 minutes in the cellar without speaking, moving from corner to corner, pressing the mortar joints, tapping the brick ceiling with the handle of a trowel she had brought in her coat pocket. When she reached the damaged northeast corner, she crouched and examined the breach with the focused intensity of a doctor examining a wound. The mortar's gone from about here to here. She traced a line with her finger. 20 inches wide, maybe 18 inches top to bottom. The stones haven't shifted much because the arch is holding them. That's the good news. The water is coming through the soil behind, not from below. That's also good, means we can pack the back side with clay before we remortar the front, and the clay will do most of the blocking. She straightened up, her knees protesting audibly. Here's what we need. Clay, there is a deposit at the creek bend half a mile south if it hasn't frozen over. Sand for the mortar mix. Lime, you have any? Marin shook her head. Hendrik stocks it. You have credit there. I have 60 days of unpaid credit there. Agnes absorbed this without visible judgment. I have lime. I'll bring it tomorrow. The clay we dig ourselves. We need 2 days of prep, 2 days of mortaring, and then we need to keep a small fire near the wall for at least 3 days while it cures. If the temperature drops below 20 before the cure sets, we start over. So we need to start now, and we need to not waste time. She looked at Marin. I'll come at dawn tomorrow. Have the clay dug by then. I don't know where the creek bend deposit is. South of your property. Walk the creek until you find the place where the bank turns red. Dig there. It's not complicated. Bring buckets. She climbed the stairs without looking back, crossed the barn, mounted the old dun horse she had ridden over, and left. She did not say goodbye. She did not say good luck. She said, Dawn, have the clay. Marin watched her go. Then she found 2 buckets, located the shovel she had been using the night before, and headed south toward the creek. The clay deposit was where Agnes had described it, a section of bank where the soil shifted from black to a deep rust red, dense and slick when she dug into it. She filled both buckets, carried them back to the barn, emptied them into the old wash tub she had dragged from the cabin, and went back for more. 6 trips. Each trip was half a mile each direction with 40 pounds of wet clay per bucket. By the fourth trip, her arms had stopped communicating specific pain and moved into a generalized trembling that she could only manage by not thinking about it. By the sixth trip, the sun was low and her legs were shaking badly enough that she sat down on the barn floor for 15 minutes before she could carry the last load down the cellar steps. Agnes arrived at dawn the next day with a sack of lime powder balanced across her saddle and a look on her face that suggested she had spent the evening reconsidering her involvement and had arrived at the same answer anyway. They worked for 4 days. The process was specific, demanding, and unforgiving. Agnes mixed the mortar by hand in a wooden trough, lime sand water, in proportions she adjusted by feel rather than measurement. She had Marin pack the clay behind the damaged section of wall, first pressing it into the gap between the stones and the soil with a flat piece of board, forcing it into every crevice until the seepage slowed from a trickle to a weep to a damp stain. Only then did Agnes begin the mortar work itself, troweling the mixture into the joints between the stones, with the careful rhythmic precision of someone who understood that mortar was not glue, but architecture. Each joint filled completely, each surface struck smooth, each excess scraped clean before it could set unevenly. The cold was a constant adversary. Mortar that froze before curing would crumble by spring, leaving them worse off than they'd started. Agnes solved this with a method that was brutally simple. She had Marin build a small fire in a bucket at the base of the repaired section, just enough heat to keep the air around the curing mortar freezing. The fire had to be tended through the night. Marin slept in 2-hour intervals, waking to feed the bucket fire check the mortar's surface temperature with her bare hand and add fuel. On the third night, Agnes stayed late. They sat together in the cellar by the bucket fire, the smoke rising through the stairwell into the barn above. Agnes produced a jar of preserved pears from her coat pocket, opened it with a pocket knife, and offered half to Marin. They ate in the underground silence, the only sound, the faint crackle of the fire, and the deeper silence of the earth around them. "You know Holt is going to fight you." Agnes spoke without looking at Marin, her eyes on the mortar watching for the particular sheen that indicated proper curing. "This isn't just about the debt. He's built his reputation on being the man who knows how to survive out here. Log walls, iron stoves, cord upon cord of oak. That's his gospel. You're sitting in a hole in the ground telling him his gospel is wrong. Men like that don't forgive heresy. I'm not trying to prove him wrong. I'm trying to not freeze to death. That's the same thing to a man like Holt." On the morning of the fourth day, Agnes tested the mortar by pressing her thumb into the joint. It held. She nodded once, the closest thing to celebration Marin would ever see from her, and pronounced the wall sound. Then she began teaching Marin the stone floor. This was the heart of Grandma Ingrid's design, the component that transformed the cellar from a mere shelter into a thermal system. Agnes studied the journal's instructions with the attentiveness of someone encountering a principle she recognized intuitively, but had never seen articulated formally. "Your grandmother understood something. Most people think stone is cold. Stone isn't cold. Stone is patient. It takes whatever temperature you give it, holds it, and gives it back slowly. A floor of dense stone properly heated becomes a stove that burns no fuel. It just remembers." The work began immediately. They lined the cellar floor with a layer of dry straw insulation between the stone above and the frozen ground below, preventing the earth from stealing the stored heat. Over this, Marin would lay the stone itself. Agnes left that afternoon with her curing tools and her empty lime sack. At the edge of the property, she turned in her saddle. Granite, not sandstone. Sandstone gives up heat like a man gives up a secret too fast when it doesn't matter anymore. Granite holds. Look for the dark stone at the old wall line on your west boundary. Erik was using it for fencing. Marin watched her ride north and then walk to the west boundary. The fieldstone wall that ran along the western edge of the quarter section had been built by Lars Hagen, badly maintained by Erik, and partially collapsed under its own neglect. It was a low, meandering line of stone that served more as a property marker than a barrier, and it was composed almost entirely of dark gray granite the glacial deposit stone that was scattered across Dakota like the aftermath of some ancient colossal construction project. Each stone weighed between 30 and 80 pounds. Maren could carry the smaller ones. The larger ones she loaded onto the small handcart Erik had built for hauling fence materials two at a time and dragged across the yard and into the barn. Inside the barn, she lowered each stone into the cellar using a rope sling she fashioned from the coil she'd found in Hagen's crate, bracing the rope against the edge of the cellar opening, controlling the descent with her body weight. It was the hardest physical work she had ever done. It was harder than the clay. It was harder than the digging. It was a kind of labor that existed beyond the range of what she had understood her body to be capable of, a frontier of effort that kept expanding just enough to accommodate one more trip, one more stone, one more lowering. Her hands, already blistered from the shovel work, cracked open at the base of each finger. She wrapped them in strips of cloth torn from an old shirt and kept working. Her back developed a specific localized pain between her shoulder blades that woke her each morning before dawn, an alarm clock made of accumulated damage. She laid the stones over the straw bed with spacing Agnes had taught her, tight but not mortared, allowing the stone to expand slightly when heated. Each stone sat flat, fitted against its neighbor, the gaps no wider than a knife blade. It took her 4 days to complete the floor. 16 days remained until December 1st. On the 12th of November, Jonas Peak rode onto her property alone. He did not come to the barn. He tied his horse at the cabin fence and knocked on the door. When no one answered, he stood in the yard for a long moment, looking at the cabin, its cold chimney, its shuttered window, the absence of any sign of habitation. Then he looked at the barn, at the mound of excavated dirt beside it, at the fresh marks in the frozen ground where the handcart had worn a path between the west fence line and the barn door. Maren watched him from inside the barn, through the gap between two wallboards. Her hands were wrapped in bloody cloth. Her hair was tied back with a piece of rope. She had not bathed properly in a week. She was standing next to a hole in the floor that led to a room full of carefully laid granite, and she was certain exactly like the kind of person Holt would describe as having lost her mind. Peak turned toward the barn. She stepped into the doorway before he could enter. Mrs. Solberg. He removed his hat, a gesture that seemed reflexive rather than sincere. I came to tell you something. I don't have to. Holt doesn't know I'm here, and I prefer to keep it that way. She waited. Holt filed a preliminary notice of abandonment with the territorial clerk's office on the 3rd. If he can demonstrate that you're not actively residing on the property, no smoke from the cabin chimney, no evidence of daily habitation, he can petition for early recovery of the land without waiting for the December deadline. The abandonment statute doesn't require your consent. It requires evidence. Maren processed this. The cabin had been cold for days. She had been sleeping in the cellar, eating in the cellar, living in the cellar. The cabin chimney had not produced smoke since the 5th. Why are you telling me this? Peak put his hat back on. His face had the particular expression of a man who was acting against his own financial interest and wanted it noted. Because Holt did the same thing to my brother's family in '82. My brother went to Bismarck for a week to find work. When he came back, the abandonment notice was already filed. Holt had the land by March. He paused. I don't have a quarrel with you, Mrs. Solberg. I want land, not someone else's misfortune. There's a difference, even if Holt can't see it. He mounted his horse. At the fence line, he turned back. Light a fire in the cabin. Every morning, even a small one, just enough for smoke. He rode east without waiting for a response. Maren stood in the barn doorway, her cracked hands at her sides, and looked at the cabin across the yard. Its cold chimney was a testimony to exactly what Holt was claiming, that the property was abandoned, that the widow had given up, that the land was waiting for a more capable owner. She crossed the yard, went inside the cabin, and built a fire with 3 of her remaining logs. The smoke rose thin and white in the morning air, visible for a mile in every direction, a flag of occupation planted in the face of a man who had already begun the paperwork to erase her. From that morning forward, she built a small fire in the cabin every day at dawn. Just enough wood to produce smoke, just enough smoke to prove existence. Then she would close the damper to slow the burn, cross the yard, enter the barn, and descend into the cellar where the real work waited. It was a performance, a daily act of theater staged for an audience of one Silas Holt, or whoever he sent to check. The cabin was a set. The cellar was the life. Reverend Crane came on the 14th of November. He was a man who wore his kindness like a well-tailored coat, visible, deliberate, fitting closely over a frame of deep conservatism. He had been the spiritual authority in the community for 11 years, a tenure that had earned him the right to enter people's homes uninvited and speak truths they had not requested. He found Marin in the cellar, standing on the completed stone floor, studying the south wall with a measuring cord stretched between her hands. "Child." His voice carried the resonance of a man accustomed to stone walls and vaulted ceilings, though the ceilings he was accustomed to were considerably higher than this one. "I heard from Mrs. Drury that you've been digging. I came to see for myself." Marin did not stop measuring. "You've seen it." He descended the last 2 steps and stood on the granite floor. She watched him register the temperature, the absence of biting cold, the still moderate air of a space insulated by the earth itself. He looked at the repaired wall, the clean stonework, the straw-insulated floor. His expression shifted through several stages: surprise, confusion, discomfort, and finally a settled concern that drew his brows together. "This is remarkable work, but it is not a home, Marin. It is a cellar. A person cannot live in a cellar. The body survives, perhaps, but the spirit requires light air, the company of others. I worry about you down here. I worry about what this solitude is doing to you. It's doing exactly what I need it to do. It's keeping me alive. There is more to living than not dying." He stepped closer, lowered his voice. "Mr. Holt came to see me last week. He asked about you, about your state of mind. He used the word fragile. He suggested that grief had perhaps affected your judgment, that you were engaged in behavior that a reasonable person would recognize as his word irrational." She stopped measuring. She looked at the Reverend directly, and the look had a quality that made him take a half step back, though he would not have admitted it. "Holt asked you if I was losing my mind." He phrased it more delicately. "He's building a case. First abandonment, now incompetence. If he can't take the land because I left it, he'll take it because I'm not sane enough to keep it." Crane's expression shifted again, this time toward genuine discomfort. The discomfort of a man who has realized he has been carrying someone else's message without knowing it. He opened his mouth, closed it, then chose different words than the ones he had prepared. "I did not come here to serve Holt's purpose. I came because I care about your welfare." "Then tell him I am perfectly sane, perfectly competent, and perfectly aware of what he is doing. Tell him I said that the ground holds heat better than his monarch stove, and that I will be here on December 1st to tell him so myself." Crane climbed the stairs slowly, each step carrying him back toward the world he understood. At the top, in the barn's cold air, he paused. "I will pray for you, Marin. Pray for warmer stone. That would be more useful." He left. His boot prints in the frost outside the barn door pointed east toward town, toward Holt's office, toward the conversation he would have to have with a man who would want to hear that the widow was indeed irrational, and the conversation he would actually have, which would be considerably less convenient. 2 weeks before the December deadline, Agnes fell. She had come that morning to inspect the mortar's cure and to advise Marin on the next phase of the construction, the ventilation system, the flue clearing the angled trench for the south-facing windows. They were walking from the barn toward the west fence line to select stones for a drainage channel when Agnes's boot caught a patch of black ice hidden under a skim of blown snow. She went down hard on her right side, her arm extending instinctively to break the fall, and the sound that came from her wrist was a small, distinct crack that carried in the cold air with terrible clarity. Agnes sat on the frozen ground, cradling her right arm, her face the color of old paper. She did not cry out. She breathed in a way that was controlled rather than calm, the breathing of someone managing pain by refusing to acknowledge its full dimension. That's broken. She stated it the way she stated everything, as a fact to be dealt with, not a grievance to be expressed. Marin helped her to the cabin. She splinted the wrist with 2 flat pieces of firewood and a strip of cotton, the field of medicine of a woman who had been married to a man with no access to doctors. Agnes sat at the table, her left hand flat on the surface, her right arm held against her chest, her eyes closed. "My son is in town, David. He'll come for me if you can get word to him." "Agnes, don't." The word was sharp enough to cut. "Don't say what you're about to say. I know what this means. I can see you counting the days in your head. I can see you calculating how much work is left and how much of it requires 2 hands. I wasn't going to say that. You were thinking it. That's the same thing with better manners." Agnes opened her eyes. The pain was there, layered beneath something harder. "The wall is done. The floor is done. What's left is the ventilation, the window trench, the rendering pot platform. You know how to do all of it. I taught you. The question is whether you can do it alone in 2 weeks. I can." Agnes looked at her for a long time. Then she stood carefully and walked to the door. Outside, the sky was a flat, featureless white that pressed down on the landscape like a lid. "I believe you can. I also believe this is the stupidest, bravest thing I've seen anyone attempt in 30 years on this prairie, and I include my own husband's decision to homestead during a grasshopper plague." She stepped outside. "Send for David. I'll be back when this heals, if you're still alive." She walked north, her broken wrist held against her coat, her silhouette shrinking against the white sky, until the landscape absorbed her entirely. Marin stood in the yard after Agnes left and allowed herself exactly 5 minutes of the terror she had been holding at arm's length. It came as a physical sensation, a loosening in her chest, a coldness in her hands that had nothing to do with the temperature, a sudden vivid awareness of how much remained to be done and how completely alone she now was in the doing of it. 5 minutes. Then she picked up the shovel and went to work on the south trench. The trench was the most labor-intensive piece of the remaining construction. Grandma Ingrid's journal specified an angled excavation on the south-facing side of the structure, sloping downward from ground level to the cellar wall, deep enough to accommodate a glazed surface window glass laid nearly flat that would capture the low winter sun and direct both light and warmth into the underground space. The angle was critical, too steep, and the sun's rays in December and January would pass over the glass rather than penetrating it. Too shallow, and snow would accumulate on the surface and block the light entirely. She dug for 7 days. The ground was half frozen at the surface, hard as concrete for the first 4 inches, then yielding to a dense, cold clay that her shovel cut through in thin slices. Each shovel load had to be carried up and out. Each day began in darkness and ended in darkness. She ate standing up, spooning cold oats from a tin cup between trips to the dirt pile. She slept in the cellar on the stone floor that was not yet charged with heat, wrapped in every blanket she owned, waking stiff and sore to a subterranean cold that was at least still and predictable. On the 5th day of digging, she reached the cellar south wall. Using Erik's saw and a cold chisel she had found in Hagen's crate, she opened a hole through the original stone foundation, a rectangle roughly 3 feet wide and 2 feet tall, the dimensions dictated by Erik's window sashes. The work was painstaking. Each stone in the foundation wall weighed more than anything she could move, so she did not move them. She chiseled the mortar from around them, pried them loose with a crowbar, and let them fall inward onto the cellar floor, where they landed with impacts she felt in her teeth. The window sashes went into the trench frame on the 20th of November. She built a wooden frame from barn lumber, seated the sashes at the angle she had calculated from the journal, 22 degrees from horizontal, and packed the joints with clay and straw. When the sun rose the next morning and hit the glass at the correct angle, a broad parallelogram of golden light appeared on the cellar floor for the first time. It moved slowly across the granite as the sun tracked west, warming each stone it touched. By late afternoon, the stones that had been in direct sun were perceptibly warm to the touch. She sat on the floor in the fading light and pressed her palms flat against the warm granite. The heat was mild, barely above body temperature, but it was real. It was stored sunlight captured through glass and held in stone, and it would radiate for hours after the sun went down. She cleared the old flue at the back of the cellar on the 21st, a full day of choking, claustrophobic work lying on her back in the narrow chimney channel, pulling out decades of debris with her bare hands. When she finally cleared the last obstruction, she felt a faint but unmistakable draft cold air from above entering the cellar, displacing the stale air, creating the circulation the space needed to remain breathable. She sealed the bottom of the flue with a damper made from a flat stone and a leather hinge, allowing her to control the airflow. Then came the rendering pot. The massive cast iron cauldron sat in the barn like a monument to a life that had been planned but not completed. Erik had bought it for soap making, for rendering the tallow from animals they had not yet acquired. It weighed more than Maren could estimate. Moving it was not possible. She built around it instead. Using the remaining barn timber, heavy beams left from the framing, she constructed a platform beside the cellar opening. She rolled the pot onto the platform using 2 round logs as rollers, a technique she found in Hagen's notebook, described in his cramped, practical handwriting as the way to move anything heavier than yourself. Don't carry it. Convince it to travel. Above the pot, she cut a 6-inch hole in the barn roof just wide enough for smoke to escape, small enough to block most weather. Below it, she left a corresponding opening in the cellar ceiling positioned so that the radiant heat from the superheated iron would pour downward into the stone-floored space beneath. November 22nd, she was ready for the first test. 8 days before Holt's deadline, she filled the rendering pot with scrap wood, broken fence rails, small branches, the splintered remains of the crate she'd found in the barn. She lit the fire with hands that shook, though, whether from cold or exhaustion or the electric fear of a hypothesis about to meet reality, she could not tell. The wood caught. Flames climbed the inside of the iron pot, and within minutes the massive vessel began to change. The black iron grew dark red at the base, then brighter, the color climbing the sides like a slow tide of captured light. Smoke poured upward through the roof hole, pulled by the cold air above. The heat went down. She descended the cellar stairs and stood beneath the opening. A column of hot air pressed against her upturned face, dry, powerful, smelling of iron and burning wood. Above the fire ward, below the granite floor, began its slow, patient work of absorption. She kept the fire burning for 3 hours, feeding it everything combustible she could spare. When the flames finally died and she sealed the cellar opening with the heavy stone slab she had prepared, she sat on her bed in the underground dark and waited. The temperature climbed. Not quickly, the thermal mass moved on its own schedule, indifferent to urgency. 50 degrees, 55, 60. Over the next 2 hours, the cellar stabilized at 63 degrees. Not the blasting heat of an iron stove, not the aggressive warmth of a well-fed fireplace. Something different entirely, an ambient, even warmth that came from below. From the floor, from every surface simultaneously, the way sunlight warms a stone wall in summer. The cellar did not have a hot spot and a cold spot. It had one temperature everywhere. She lay on her mattress that night and felt the stored heat rising through the floor beneath her, a warmth so steady and so quiet it felt like something the earth had been saving for whoever thought to ask. The morning of November 25th began with a sound Maren did not immediately recognize, hoofbeats, more than one horse coming fast from the east road. She was in the cellar checking the floor temperature, with her palm still 60 degrees 36 hours after the last fire, the granite releasing its stored heat with the miserly patience of a substance that understood conservation at the molecular level. She climbed the stairs, pushed the slab aside, and crossed the barn to the door. Holt had brought the deputy. The 2 men dismounted in the yard. The deputy, a heavy-set man named Walter Goss, carried a folded document in his coat pocket. Holt carried nothing except the expression of a man who has decided to end a problem ahead of schedule. Mrs. Solberg. Holt's voice was the voice of business, of finality, of a man who considered himself reasonable and expected the world to agree. I have here a notice of abandonment filed with the territorial clerk. Your cabin has shown no evidence of regular habitation for. I live here. Marin stepped into the yard. She was wearing Erik's second wool shirt under her coat. Her hair was tied back with the same piece of rope she had been using for 2 weeks. She looked like a person who had been doing hard physical labor in cold weather for a month, which is exactly what she was. Holt looked at the cabin behind her, no smoke from the chimney, frost on the inside of the windows. The door had the particular set of a door that has not been properly opened and closed daily. The frost seal at the threshold was unbroken. The cabin is clearly, I don't live in the cabin, no. He stared at her. The deputy shifted his weight. I live in the barn. Holt turned toward the barn as if seeing it for the first time. The thin line of smoke from the roof hole had dissipated. The mound of excavated dirt beside the wall had grown larger since his last visit. The handcart track between the barn and the west fence line was worn deep into the frozen ground. He walked to the barn. She did not try to stop him. He entered his boots loud on the packed earth floor. She watched him scan the interior, the rendering pot on its platform, the rope and beam apparatus she used for lowering stones, the tools arranged along the wall with the organizational precision of someone who could not afford to waste time looking for things. His eyes found the stone slab covering the cellar opening. He walked to it. He could feel it, a faint, impossible warmth radiating from the edges of the slab, heat leaking from the sealed space below. He pushed the slab with his boot. It shifted a quarter inch. He crouched, gripped the edge, and slid it sideways. Warm air rose from the opening, visible in the cold barn, as a shimmer of heat distortion. He looked down into her cellar. The granite floor, the repaired stone walls, the window light slanting through the south-facing glass, the bed with its quilts, the provisions stacked neatly along the far wall. A small, complete, functional world, 10 feet below the surface of a prairie that was trying very hard to kill everything on it. He looked at this for what felt like a long time. Then he looked at Marin, who had followed him inside and stood near the barn door with her arms at her sides. Not defensive, not defiant, simply present. This is where you live. This is where I live. Deputy Goss had entered behind them. He looked into the cellar with the bewildered expression of a man encountering something outside the vocabulary of his experience. He looked at Holt. Holt's jaw was working the muscles at the hinge of his mandible, flexing with the effort of processing information that did not fit into any category he had built. This doesn't change the deadline. His voice was tighter than before, compressed by something that was not anger exactly, but was adjacent to it, the particular frustration of a man who has predicted an outcome and must now account for its failure to materialize. I didn't ask it to. December 1st. I'll be here. Goss touched Holt's sleeve, a gentle redirecting gesture that said clearly, there is nothing to file here. They left. Holt's horse kicked a clod of frozen dirt as it turned. The sound was small and final, like a period at the end of a sentence that had not gone the way its author intended. The rendering pot cracked on the 28th of November. The temperature had dropped to 25 below zero overnight, a plunge so severe that the ground itself seemed to contract, the barn timbers popping in the cold, with sounds like distant gunshots. Marin had built a fire in the pot at dusk as usual, but the thermal shock, extreme cold iron meeting extreme flame, found the hairline flaw that had been invisible in the casting and split the pot along a seam that ran from the rim to the base in a single irreversible fracture. She heard it from below, a sound like a large bell being struck off-key. She climbed the stairs and found the pot cracked open, the fire dying inside it, the heat escaping laterally through the fracture rather than radiating downward. She stood in the coal barn and stared at the ruined pot and felt the specific weight of a system failure at the worst possible time. 3 days before Holt's deadline, the temperature outside lethal, the only mechanism for charging the thermal battery destroyed. She went back down into the cellar. She opened Grandma Ingrid's journal and read the section on heat charging for the 5th time, looking for something she had missed. Then she looked at the two smaller cast iron pots that sat against the cellar wall, a Dutch oven, and a deep skillet she had brought down for cooking. Together, they held perhaps a quarter of the volume of the rendering pot. Individually, they were manageable. She carried them upstairs. She built two small platforms, one on each side of the cellar opening, and set the pots on them. She built separate small fires in each. The heat output was a fraction of what the rendering pot had provided, but it was concentrated two narrow columns of radiant warmth pouring down into the stone floor from 2 points instead of one. She ran both fires for 4 hours. The cellar temperature stabilized at 60 degrees instead of 63. Adequate. Not comfortable by the standard she had briefly achieved, but adequate. She would need to fire them every 2 days instead of every 3. She would burn more wood. The margin was thinner, but the system held. December 1st. Maren woke in the cellar at 5 in the morning, the stone floor radiating its patient warmth into the still air. She dressed in the dark Erik's shirt, her own wool skirt, the heavy coat, the scarf. She climbed the stairs, crossed the barn, and went to the cabin. She built a fire in the cabin hearth, a real one this time, feeding it 3 full logs. She put water on to boil. She swept the floor. She opened the shutters and let the thin winter light enter the room. Then she sat at the table and waited. He came at 10, alone this time. No deputy, no peek, just Silas Holt dismounting heavily, his breath pluming in the frigid air, his leather satchel under his arm. She was not in the cabin. She was in the barn. Sitting on a wooden stool she had brought up from the cellar, wearing her coat unbuttoned despite the cold, Grandma Ingrid's journal open on her lap. She had positioned the stool directly over the sealed cellar opening. The stone slab beneath her radiated warmth that she could feel through her boots. She was waiting for him. She had been waiting for him since the moment he first stood in her doorway in October and told her that her story was over. He entered the barn. He looked at her sitting on the stool with the journal calm, in a way that was not performed but actual, the calm of a person who has done the math and arrived at an answer she can defend. "You're still here." His voice carried something it had not carried before, not surprise because he had already been surprised on the 25th. Something deeper, something that grated against the architecture of his certainty like sand in a well-oiled mechanism. "I told you I would be." He held the satchel. Inside it was the deed transfer, the signature line still blank. He had carried it to this property 4 times now. 4 times the ritual had failed to produce its intended result. Mrs. Solberg Maren. He used her name. The shift was involuntary, a concession his mouth made before his pride could intervene. "I have watched 14 families try to survive what is coming. The ones who succeeded did it with fire and timber and iron, the way I taught them. The ones who failed..." He stopped. "I am not your enemy. Are you my benefactor?" The question landed in the space between them, with the weight of everything it implied. He had no answer for it that did not reveal something about himself that he was not prepared to reveal. "I built my reputation on knowing how to survive here. I have a wife, 2 children, the largest house in the county. I have kept people alive through winters that killed their neighbors. That is not nothing." "It is not nothing," her voice was level, free of mockery, "but it is also not the only way." She closed the journal. She stood. She looked at him without anger, without pleading, without any of the emotions he had prepared himself to manage. "You worry about me because you think you understand what will happen. You build to fight the cold. I built to escape it. Come back when you need to know the difference." Holt stood in the barn holding his satchel, his breath visible, his certainty cracking along a seam he had not known existed. He turned. He walked to his horse. He mounted. He rode away, the hoofbeats fading into the vast, cold silence of a landscape that did not care about deadlines or deeds or the hierarchies of men. Maren stood in the barn door and watched him go. The 3rd departure. The 3rd failure to collect her signature. The wind cut across the yard raw with the promise of everything that was still to come. The deep cold, the real cold. The cold that would test every joint of mortar, and every square inch of stone and every principle written in a dead woman's journal. She was tired. She was bruised, her hands mapped with wounds from work she had never been built to do. But beneath the exhaustion, something had settled into place. Not confidence exactly, but the absence of doubt which serves the same purpose. She had 60 degrees of stolen warmth beneath her feet, a system that held walls that did not leak light that entered from an angle her grandmother had calculated decades ago in a farmhouse in Minnesota for a winter that had not yet arrived. December 1st passed. The unsigned deed remained in Holt's satchel. Maren descended into the earth, pulled the slab closed above her, and lay in the quiet warmth of a room that owed its existence to two dead women's knowledge. One dead man's lumber, a stranger's abandoned cellar, and the particular stubbornness of a 19-year-old widow who had chosen a third option when she was given only two. Above her, the winter settled in. Below her, the stones held what summer had given them. The weeks between December 1st and January 12th had a quality that Maren would later describe to no one because the language for it did not exist in the vocabulary of prairie survival. It was not comfort. It was not safety. It was something closer to a negotiated truce between her body and the work it had endured, between her cellar and the winter pressing down on it, between the woman she had been 6 months ago and the woman she was becoming in the underground dark. She developed a routine that was governed by the thermal cycle of the stone floor. Every second day, she climbed the stairs at dawn, built fires in the two small cast iron pots, and tended them for 4 hours. The rest of the time, she lived below. She cooked oat porridge on a small alcohol stove she had salvaged from the cabin, a brass camping burner Erik had bought from a catalog the previous spring, imagining weekend fishing trips that never materialized. The flame was small, the heat minimal, but in the cellar's sealed environment, even that modest output contributed to the ambient warmth. Steam from the porridge would rise and settle on the nearest surface, leaving a fine dew on the pages of whatever book she was reading. She read a great deal. The trunk in the cabin had held, besides the journal, 4 books, a collection of essays by Emerson, a battered almanac from 1885, a novel by a writer she had never heard of, about a family on the Kansas frontier, and the small poetry volume her sister had given her. She brought them all underground. She rationed them the way she rationed food, a chapter per day of the novel, a single essay per sitting of Emerson. The almanac consulted only when she needed specific agricultural data. The poetry she allowed herself without restriction, because poetry occupied a different economy than information. It cost nothing to reread. It paid out differently each time. The light through the south-facing windows became the metronome of her days. It entered the cellar each morning as a pale, narrow blade tracked slowly across the granite floor until mid-afternoon, then retreated, leaving the stones it had touched perceptibly warmer than those it hadn't. On clear days, the parallelogram of sunlight was sharp-edged and golden. On cloudy days, it arrived as a diffuse silver glow that provided illumination but little heat. She learned to read the weather by the quality of light on her floor, a barometric instrument made of glass and stone. She thought about Erik still constantly, but the texture of the thinking had changed. In the first weeks after his death, memory had been a knife, each recollection, a wound reopened, each familiar object, a trigger for the specific physical pain of absence. Now living inside the structure his lumber had framed, sleeping above a floor she had built with stone from a wall he had started using tools, his hands had worn smooth. The thinking had become less like bleeding and more like archaeology. She was excavating him, finding the outlines of the life he had planned, the intentions embedded in every board he had cut, every nail he had driven. The barn was his blueprint. The cellar was her revision. Together they constituted something neither of them could have built alone. She found the iron hook on the cellar wall on a Tuesday in late December. It was mounted at shoulder height on the south wall, driven deep into the mortar between 2 stones, a heavy hand-forged hook of the kind used for hanging cured meat or heavy tools. Lars Hagen had probably installed it. It had been there for a decade, doing nothing, waiting for a purpose. She hung Erik's coat on it. The brown wool coat he had worn the day he rode to Holt's office to sign the extension papers, the day he came home with relief on his face disguised as confidence. She had kept it folded in the trunk since September. Now she hung it where she could see it from the bed, where the morning light through the windows would catch the fabric each day, where it occupied the space between present and past the way a photograph does, proof that something existed, that it mattered, that its absence was a shape rather than an emptiness. She wrote a letter to her mother on Christmas Day. She sat on the bed with a board across her knees as a desk, the candle guttering in a faint draft from the flue, and she wrote 4 pages in a hand that started controlled and ended looser, the way handwriting does when the writer stops performing composure and starts simply writing. She described the cellar. She described the stone floor, the light, the warmth. She described Agnes. She did not describe Holt except as a man who holds the note on the property. She did not describe her fear because by Christmas she was no longer certain, she was afraid, and honesty prevented her from performing an emotion she could not locate. She did not send the letter. She folded it, placed it between the pages of the poetry book, and returned to the routine of living. The letter existed not as communication, but as evidence proof that she had been here in this specific place, at this specific time, thinking these specific thoughts. If the winter took her, someone would eventually find the letter. If it didn't, she would send it in spring with a postscript. The temperature outside dropped through December like a stone falling through water, 10 below 1520. On the 28th, the thermometer at Hendrick's store in town read 32 below zero, a number that existed beyond the boundary of cold, as most people understood it. At that temperature, exposed skin froze in minutes. Breath crystallized before it left the mouth. The moisture in a person's eyes could ice over if they faced the wind for too long. The landscape ceased to be a place and became a condition, a state of matter as hostile to human existence as the surface of the moon. In the cellar, Marin's floor held at 59 degrees on its low cycle, 62 on its high. She slept under 2 quilts. She was not warm the way a person sitting beside a roaring stove is warm. She was warm the way a person sleeping in a well-insulated bed is warm, gently, consistently, without the violent fluctuation between scorching proximity to flame and freezing distance from it that characterized every stove-heated cabin on the plains. The warmth came from everywhere and nowhere. It rose through the floor. It radiated from the walls. It was the temperature of the earth itself, offered freely to anyone who thought to ask for it. Her wood consumption was a fraction of what any cabin on the prairie required. 2 small fires every other day, burning scrap lumber and brush for 4 hours each, while her neighbors fed their monarch stoves around the clock, burning through cords of carefully stacked oak and elm at a rate that made the winter feel like a furnace with a mouth. Marin's system ran on the thermal equivalent of loose change. The 2 small pots were not efficient. They were not elegant, but they were sufficient because the system did not depend on continuous combustion. It depended on stone on mass, on the patient physics of a material that absorbed heat and released it on a schedule governed by molecular structure rather than human urgency. January arrived without ceremony. The deep cold that had characterized December did not relent. It intensified the way a siege intensifies when the besieging army realizes it cannot simply wait and must apply additional pressure. The wind shifted from its usual westerly pattern to a sustained northern flow that carried air directly from the Canadian plains, unobstructed by any terrain feature for 600 miles. The community contracted. Travel between homesteads ceased. Families that had laid in what they considered adequate supplies began to ration. Families that had not were in immediate danger. Marin received no visitors in January. The road past her property was impassable, drifted over with hard-packed snow that the wind had sculpted into forms that looked intentional, as though the winter were making a point about permanence. She saw no one. She heard nothing except the wind above transmitted through the barn's timbers as a low, constant vibration that became over the days a kind of silence, the background noise of a world that had stopped pretending to be habitable. She spoke to Erik's coat sometimes. Not in conversation, she had not lost that particular grip on reality, but in the brief, direct way a person speaks to an object that represents a person. Good morning. Terrible wind today. I think the south window might need recaulking. She spoke to herself more frequently. She narrated her own actions, a habit she had developed during the weeks of heavy construction when the sound of a human voice, even her own, served as evidence that the silence had not swallowed her entirely. She described what she was doing as she did it now. I am lighting the stove. Now I am opening the flue. Now I am checking the mortar on the northeast corner. It was not madness. It was maintenance, the upkeep of a self that might otherwise have drifted into the vast, featureless quiet of January underground, like a boat slipping its mooring. On the morning of January 12th, she woke to a quality of silence that was different from the silence she had become accustomed to. The wind had stopped, not diminished, not shifted, stopped. The barn timbers above her, which had been vibrating with the sustained pressure of moving air for weeks, were suddenly absolutely still. The absence of the vibration was more unsettling than the vibration itself, the way the absence of pain after a long illness can feel like a symptom of something worse. She climbed the stairs and pushed the slab aside. The barn was cold, bitterly, deeply cold, in a way that felt different from the previous weeks. The air had a crystalline quality, as though each molecule of oxygen had been individually frozen and suspended in place. She walked to the barn door and looked out. The sky was wrong. It was the color of a bruise that has not yet decided whether it will heal or worsen, a yellow-gray that sat low over the landscape, pressing down with a weight that was almost physical. The horizon had disappeared. The line where land met sky had been erased, replaced by a seamless, ominous merging of earth and atmosphere that made the world look sealed, as though someone had closed a lid over the prairie. She had never seen a sky this color. She did not need to have seen it before to understand what it meant. The body has an older vocabulary than the mind for certain kinds of danger, a vocabulary written in the quickening of the pulse and the tightening of the muscles across the back of the neck. Her body was using that vocabulary now. She heard hoofbeats, fast from the east. Jonah's Peak materialized out of the yellow-gray distance like a figure emerging from a photograph that was still developing, blurred at first and sharp. He was riding hard, his horse laboring through the crusted snow, his coat flapping. He reached the edge of her property, pulled the horse to a stop, and looked at the sky. Then he looked at the barn, at Marin standing in the doorway. Their eyes met across 60 yards of frozen ground. He did not dismount. He did not speak. He held her gaze for 3 seconds, then wheeled his horse and spurred it toward town, riding east with the urgency of a man who has calculated how much time remains and found the number insufficient. Marin watched him disappear. She understood the message his silence had delivered. Whatever is coming, it is coming now, and I cannot help you. She went back inside the barn. She built fires in both small pots, using the last of the scrap lumber she had stockpiled. She charged the floor for 2 hours instead of the usual 4, because 2 hours was what she had before the sky delivered on its promise. She sealed the pots, covered them, carried an armload of brush down into the cellar as emergency fuel pulled the slab closed above her, and waited. The storm arrived at approximately 2 in the afternoon. Though the word arrived implies a process of approach, a transition from absence to presence that was entirely inadequate for what actually occurred. The blizzard did not arrive. It detonated. One moment the world was silent, the yellow-gray sky pressing down with its ominous weight. The next moment, the world ceased to exist and was replaced by a horizontal wall of white, moving at a velocity that registered not as wind, but as impact. The barn shuddered. The timbers above the cellar groaned with a sound Marin had never heard from wood before, the sound of a material reaching the boundary of its tolerance and beginning to negotiate with failure. The temperature collapsed. She could feel it even underground, even through 10 feet of earth. A plunge so violent it seemed to have physical force, as though the cold were not a condition, but a substance being poured over the landscape. The air in the cellar dropped 2 degrees in the first hour, then stabilized. Above, the storm was doing things to the prairie that would not be fully understood until it was over. The sound was the worst part, not the wind itself, which was a sustained roar so constant it became texture rather than event. The worst part was what the wind carried, a high oscillating shriek produced by the fine dry snow being driven horizontally at 50 miles per hour through every gap, every crack, every structural weakness in every building on the plains. It was the sound of a world being sandpapered down to its foundations. Marin sat on her bed with her back against the stone wall, her quilts wrapped around her shoulders, Grandma Ingrid's journal in her lap. The candle flame did not move. The air in the cellar was so still, so insulated from the chaos above, that the flame burned perfectly vertical, a small, unwavering point of light in a universe of howling darkness. The temperature on her floor read 57 degrees. Livable, not generous, but livable. The granite was giving back the heat she had charged it with that morning, molecule by patient molecule. She was lonely. She was tired. Her hands ached with the deep, bone-level ache of tissue that has been damaged repeatedly and healed imperfectly. But she was also calm, with a calm born not of hope but of completed preparation. Fear requires uncertainty, and she had spent 3 months eliminating every uncertainty she could reach. The wall was mortared, the floor was laid, the system was tested. The physics were not debatable. Either the cellar held or it didn't, and she had done everything within the capacity of her body and her knowledge to ensure that it held. She opened the journal. She turned to the last page Grandma Ingrid had written, in a page she had read many times but which carried different weight now in the specific silence of this specific storm. The handwriting was smaller here, as though Ingrid had been conserving space, or as though the thoughts had become more concentrated. Do not be ashamed of the earth. Men build upward because they are proud. They build toward the sky because they believe height is strength. But the deepest foundations are the ones that remember what the surface forgets. The earth does not fight the cold. The earth simply continues at its own temperature, at its own pace, beneath all the fury that the sky can produce. She closed the journal. She listened to the storm. She waited. 7 miles east, in the largest house in the county, Silas Holt was losing his war. The Monarch stove, his crown jewel, 400 pounds of cast iron imported from a foundry in Ohio, was running at full capacity. The firebox was packed with split oak. The draft was wide open. The stovepipe glowed a dull orange that meant the internal temperature had passed 600 degrees. The stove was doing everything it had been designed to do, everything Holt had built his entire philosophy of survival around, and it was failing. The failure was not dramatic. It was incremental, which made it worse. The stove produced a sphere of fierce heat with a radius of approximately 8 feet. Inside that radius, the temperature was bearable, hot, even close to the iron. Outside it, the temperature dropped with a gradient so steep it felt like crossing a border. The parlor 12 feet from the stove was 45 degrees. The kitchen 20 feet away was 38. The bedrooms at the back of the house were below freezing. Ice had formed on the inside of every window. The water in the kitchen basin was a solid block. Clara Holt had gathered the children into the parlor, pulling the mattresses from the bedrooms and laying them on the floor near the stove. Thomas, 8 years old, sat closest to the iron with a blanket over his head, his eyes wide. Ruth, 5, had fallen into an uneasy sleep in her mother's arms, her breathing shallow with the cold she had developed 3 days earlier. Clara held her with the focused intensity of a woman whose world had contracted to the circumference of her arms. The woodpile was the problem. Holt had laid in what he calculated to be a sufficient supply: 4 cords of split oak stacked along the exterior wall of the house under a timber lean-to. 4 cords was enough for a standard winter burning at the standard rate in a house built to the standard he had established over 19 years of construction in the territory. But this storm was not standard. The wind was not standard. The cold was a category of its own, so far beyond the range of his experience that his calculations were meaningless. The arithmetic of a man who had been solving the wrong equation his entire career. He had burned through 3 cords in the week since December. The remaining cord, a stack roughly 4 feet high, 4 feet wide, and 8 feet long, was disappearing at a rate he could no longer pretend was sustainable. Each feeding of the stove consumed an armload. Each armload lasted an hour. Each hour was a subtraction from a diminishing total. He did the math in his head while he watched the stovepipe glow, the math that men do when the numbers have turned hostile. At the current rate, he had 20 hours of fuel remaining. The storm showed no indication of stopping. He sat in the chair nearest the stove, his large frame hunched, his hands extended toward the iron. He was a man built for authority, broad shoulders, heavy jaw, the physical vocabulary of someone accustomed to occupying space decisively. Now he looked compressed, diminished, as though the cold were not just lowering the temperature, but reducing the man himself. He was thinking about Maren Solberg. He did not want to be thinking about her. He wanted to be thinking about fuel solutions, about emergency measures, about the specific practical steps a man of his experience could take to survive the next 24 hours. Instead, he was thinking about a 19-year-old woman sitting in a hole in the ground with a stone floor, and the look on her face on December 1st when she had asked him, "Are you my benefactor?" He was thinking about the warmth he had felt radiating from the edges of the cellar slab on November 25th, a warmth with no visible source, a warmth that contradicted everything he understood about heat, about cold, about the relationship between fire and survival. He had dismissed it. He had categorized it as an aberration, a temporary condition, a trick of some kind. He had been so certain. Clara's voice cut through the roar of the storm and the roar of his own thoughts. "Do you think she's alive?" He looked at his wife. She was watching him over Ruth's sleeping head, her face drawn with cold, her eyes steady with the particular clarity of a woman who has been observing her husband arrive at a conclusion he has not yet acknowledged. "The Solberg woman, do you think she survived this?" Holt did not answer. The question was dangerous. If she was dead, then his worldview held the cellar was folly. His methods were correct. The universe operated according to the principles he had championed. If she was alive, then every house he had built, every cord of wood he had prescribed, every family he had instructed in the gospel of mass and fire was a monument to a fundamental misunderstanding. "If she's alive and we don't help her, I will never forgive you, Silas. If she's dead because no one checked, I will never forgive any of us." The words landed with the force of a verdict. Not anger, something heavier, the weight of a moral obligation that Clara had been carrying since October, since the first time Holt had come home from the Solberg property, and described the widow's project with contempt, since the first time Clara had heard the word folly used to describe a woman trying to save her own life. Holt stared at the stove. The oak inside it crackled. The iron glowed. The temperature 6 feet from the firebox was 70 degrees. The temperature at the back wall of the parlor was 41. His children were sleeping on the floor because the bedrooms were uninhabitable. His fortress was failing. He stood up. He put on his coat, his heaviest. He pulled the fur hat down to his eyebrows. He wrapped a wool scarf around the lower half of his face, leaving only his eyes exposed. "I'm going to the Solberg place." Clara did not ask why. She shifted Ruth's weight to one arm, reached out with the other, and gripped his hand. The grip was brief, fierce, communicating everything she would not say in front of the children. "Come back. Bring her back. Be the man I married, not the man you have been." He opened the door. The storm hit him with a physical force that knocked him sideways into the doorframe. The world outside was not visible. It was not a landscape with snow falling on it. It was a substance, a thick, moving white substance that occupied all available space and denied the existence of anything within it. He stepped off the porch and into it, and the world he had lived in for 43 years disappeared. He could not see. He could not hear anything except the wind, which was not wind anymore, but a continuous explosion of air, a sound so large and so constant it obliterated the concept of sound itself. He could not breathe without the scarf because the air was so cold and so full of fine-driven snow that inhaling unfiltered meant choking. He walked into this. He navigated by a single piece of knowledge: the wind was from the north. It had been from the north since the storm began. As long as he walked with the wind hitting his left cheek, he was heading roughly west toward the Solberg property. It was not navigation, it was a guess dressed up in the clothing of reason. He fell within the first 100 yards. The snow under his boots was not a surface but a deception, hard packed in one place, soft and bottomless. 2 steps later, he went down on his hands and knees, the cold biting through his gloves instantly, the snow packing into his collar and melting against his neck. He got up. He fell again. He lost the fence line he had been following and spent what felt like 5 minutes or 15 or 30 time, had no meaning, floundering in a drift that reached his chest, the white pressing against him from every direction with the intimate hostility of something trying to absorb him. His beard froze, his eyelashes froze, the moisture in his nostrils froze into small, painful crystals that broke each time he breathed in. He was a large man, a strong man, a man who had spent 2 decades on the plains and believed he understood what the plains could do. The plains were teaching him otherwise. They were teaching him that understanding based on experience was a house of cards, useful in ordinary conditions, catastrophic when the conditions exceeded the range of experience. He had built his philosophy on a sample size that did not include the storm. The storm was the outlier that made the sample meaningless. He reached the Solberg property by dead reckoning and luck. The luck was the fence post, his outstretched hand hid in the whiteout, the corner post of her west boundary, which he identified by the shape of the wire attachment, a detail his builder's hands recognized when his eyes could provide nothing. He followed the fence line south, then east, his hand never leaving the wire until the dark shape of the barn materialized in the white, like a hallucination granting itself substance. He fell through the barn door and lay on the packed earth floor, gasping. His lungs burned. His fingers had stopped reporting sensation. His legs were shaking with a tremor that originated not in fatigue but in the deep cold's assault on his core temperature. He lay there and listened to the storm shriek through the barn timbers, a sound like the world being torn in half. He saw the glow. It was faint, barely perceptible, coming from the edge of the stone slab covering the cellar opening. A warm amber light leaking through the thin gap between stone and earth. He crawled toward it, his frozen gloves scraped against the slab. He tried to move it. His hands would not close properly. He struck the slab with his fist. The sound was dull, absorbed by the cold, carrying nowhere. He struck again. "Hello?" The word came out broken, fragmented by the cold in his throat. "Is anyone there?" Silence from below. Then a scraping sound, stone on stone, and the slab shifted sideways. Warm air rose from the opening with the force of something that had been contained, a breath the earth had been holding. It washed over his face, his frozen beard, his ice-rimmed eyes. The warmth was not the aggressive directional heat of a stove. It was ambient, total, coming from everywhere at once. It smelled of earth, of warm stone, of something baking. Bread. She had baked bread. Her face appeared in the opening. Lit from below by the candle in her hand, her features had the quality of something painted. The high cheekbones, the dark eyes, the expression that was not triumph but recognition. The look of a person seeing a specific outcome materialize that she had considered but not expected. Mr. Holt. He could not form a complete sentence. He looked at her. She was wearing a cotton dress, no coat, her hair loose on her shoulders. The air rising past her carried the temperature of a mild autumn afternoon. Behind her he could see the cellar, the granite floor, the quilted bed, the south-facing window, dark with storm, but framed with care, the book lying open on the mattress, the coat hanging on the iron hook. He recognized that coat. It was the brown wool Erik Solberg had been wearing the day he came to Holt's office to negotiate the extension, the collateral visit that Holt had approved not out of generosity, but because the land was worth more than the debt. The coat was on the wall. Holt was on his knees. The mathematics of who owed whom what had undergone a revision so thorough it registered as a physical sensation. "Come down before you freeze to death up there." Her voice carried the same levelness it had carried in every conversation they'd had, but something was different underneath it, a gentleness that was not weak but was specifically deliberately merciful. He half fell down the stone steps, his frozen boots slipping on the surface, his hands grabbing the wall for balance. He landed on the granite floor of her cellar, and the heat that entered his body through his boot soles felt like an answer to a question he had been asking his entire life without knowing he was asking it. He stood in the small room, dripping meltwater onto her floor, shaking with a violence that was part cold and part something else, the physiological response to a worldview collapsing, which turns out to feel remarkably similar to hypothermia. He looked at the walls. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at the floor that was radiating warmth, generated by two small cast iron pots, and retained by the granite laid by a woman who weighed 115 pounds. Marin. Her name again, not Mrs. Solberg. The formality had frozen off him somewhere in the whiteout, along with his certainty, his authority, his 20 years of being right. "My family, my house, the fire isn't enough. The wood is gone." She looked at him. He saw her register the information process and measure the implications. He saw the moment when compassion overtook every other possible response, every justified anger, every earned resentment, every right she had to let him suffer the consequences of his own philosophy. "Bring them here." He closed his eyes. The words entered him with the warmth of the floor, with the stillness of the air, with the profound, devastating simplicity of an act of grace performed by a person who had every reason to withhold it. He climbed the stairs. He stepped back into the storm. The cold hit him like something personal, like the winter had been waiting for him specifically, but this time he was moving with the particular velocity of a man who knows exactly where warmth is and has people who need it. He followed the fence line back. He burst through his own front door. Clara looked up from the children on the floor. "Get them dressed, all of them. Now, we're going." He did not explain. Clara did not ask. She wrapped Thomas in 2 blankets. She bundled Ruth into her own coat, the child's small face barely visible between collar and hat. Holt tied them together with rope himself, Clara Thomas. Ruth, a chain of 4 bodies linked at the waist, a family reduced to its most elemental structure, people who are attached to each other and moving toward heat. They went into the storm. That night, Silas Holt sat on a wooden crate in the corner of a 10 by 12 stone room, 10 feet below a barn on a quarter section of Dakota prairie that he had tried to take from the woman who was now feeding his children bread she had baked on an alcohol stove. Thomas was asleep on the mattress, his body curled around his sister, both of them breathing with the even rhythm of children who have been warm long enough to forget they were ever cold. Clara sat on the bed's edge, her hand on Thomas's back, her eyes moving slowly around the cellar with the careful attention of someone committing a space to permanent memory. Holt sat with his elbows on his knees, his head low. The storm above was a muffled roar, the sound of an ocean, heard from the bottom of a swimming hole present, but powerless. The temperature in the room was 58 degrees. His children were sleeping without shivering for the first time in 3 days. Marin sat on the floor opposite him, her back against the south wall below the dark rectangle of the snow-covered window. The candle between them threw their shadows large on the stone walls. He looked at the coat on the hook for a long time. 14 families. I told myself each one was a resolution. Clean, fair. The railroad held the notes the settlers couldn't pay. I facilitated the transfer. Everyone ended up where they belonged. He paused. No one ever ended up where they belonged. They ended up where I put them. Clara looked at her husband from the bed. She had known this. She had known it for years in the way that wives know things not through confrontation, but through accumulation, the slow deposit of observations that eventually form a stratum too thick to deny. How does this work? Holt's voice was quieter now, stripped of performance. He was looking at the floor. The stones are warm. There is no fire. How does this work? Marin explained it simply the way Grandma Ingrid had written it, the way Agnes had understood it without needing it explained at all. The earth below the frost line, the thermal mass of dense stone, the periodic charging with intense heat, the slow release over days. The principle was not revolutionary. It was ancient. It was the way the ground had always worked. The only thing that was new was the decision to use it. Holt listened with his builder's mind, which could not help itself. It was already running calculations, already translating principles into specifications, already redesigning every house he had ever built. The habit of competence does not die with the death of its assumptions. It redirects. I built every house in this county to fight the cold. Thick walls, heavy iron, cord after cord of oak. I built fortresses. He looked up. Fortresses fail when the siege lasts longer than the supply. You built something else. You built something that doesn't need a supply. It needs the ground. The ground was always there, under every house you built. The sentence sat in the room like a stone placed precisely in a wall. Small load-bearing, impossible to remove without compromising the structure around it. The storm lasted 3 days. On the fourth morning, the wind died with the abruptness of a machine being switched off, and a silence descended on the territory that was so absolute it had physical properties, weight, texture, temperature. The sky cleared to a blue so deep it looked artificial, the blue of something painted by a hand that had no interest in subtlety. Marin pushed the slab open and climbed into a world she did not recognize. The barn was standing, but altered snow had forced through every crack in the timber, leaving white ridges along every horizontal surface. Outside, the landscape was buried. The drifts reached the barn's eaves in places sculpted by the wind into formations that looked deliberate, architectural, as though the storm had been building something of its own. The Holt family emerged behind her, blinking in the brilliant light. Thomas held Ruth's hand. Clara held her husband's arm, not for support, but for contact. The human need to touch someone at a moment when the world has changed shape. Jonas Peak arrived 3 hours later with a party of 7 men on horseback, cutting a path through the drifts from town. He had ridden to Reverend Crane's house during the yellow sky morning of January 12th and told him the Solberg woman is alone out there. Someone needs to check. It was this act, not heroic, not dramatic, simply the decision of a man who had once lost something to Holt's system and chose not to let it happen again, that brought the rescue party to the right farm on the right morning. They came expecting to find a body. They found a family. Reverend Crane descended the cellar steps with the caution of a man entering a space that has already proven him wrong. He stood on the warm granite floor, looked at the repaired walls, the south-facing window now cleared of snow, and admitting a blade of brilliant January sunlight, the provisions stacked neatly, the book on the bed, the coat on the hook. He pressed his palm to the floor. He felt the warmth. He did not speak. He bowed his head, not in prayer, though it looked like prayer, in concession. Holt stood before the assembled men in the barn, his face raw with windburn, his eyes carrying the particular exhaustion of a man who has been awake for 3 days inside a revelation. When he spoke, his voice was quiet in a way that carried further than volume. I built every home in this county. I told every family the same thing: more wood, thicker walls, bigger fire. I was wrong, not partially wrong, wrong at the foundation. She did what I told her was impossible, and she did it with a dead woman's notebook and a floor made of stone. If anyone here is interested in surviving the next winter differently, you should be talking to her, not to me. He reached into his coat. He took out the leather satchel he had carried to this property 4 times. He opened it, removed the deed transfer document with its unsigned line, and tore it in half, then in quarters. He let the pieces fall onto the barn floor where they lay on the packed earth like the fragments of a contract the earth itself had voided. Mrs. Solberg, Marin, I will speak with the railroad office. The note will be restructured. 3 years reduced interest. It is the least of what is owed, and I am aware it is not enough. Marin stood near the cellar, opening the warm air rising past her into the coal barn, her hands at her sides. She did not smile. She did not gloat. She inclined her head, a gesture so small it might have been missed, but Holt saw it, and it was sufficient. Spring came the way spring comes to the northern plains, grudgingly in increments, as though the season were being extracted from the earth rather than arriving upon it. The snow retreated. The creek ran. The ground thawed in layers, releasing the particular smell of soil returning to biological activity, the smell of a planet remembering that it has purposes beyond endurance. Marin's Cellar became a destination. Farmers came from 20 miles to see it. Agnes Drury, her wrist healed into a knot of bone that ached in wet weather, but functioned adequately, stood beside Marin and explained the mortar technique to men who listened with the chastened attention of students who have recently failed an important exam. Peake bought a quarter section 3 miles south and began digging his own cellar, following Marin's specifications with her assistance. Not everyone converted. Some men looked at the cellar, acknowledged its effectiveness, and returned to their stoves. The gospel of fire was old and deeply held, and not every congregation abandons its faith after a single miracle. But enough changed. New homesteads went up with deeper foundations. South-facing windows appeared where none had been before. The stoves burned on, but less desperately supplemented by the quiet, tireless work of the earth beneath. Holt kept his word on the debt. He visited the railroad office in Bismarck, personally returning with restructured terms that gave Marin 3 years at a rate she could manage. He did more than that, though he did it quietly without the public performance that had characterized his previous authority.